Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you all for being with us today. Like Heather said, so I actually did a factory tour for a customer this week. And once again, I was reminded why I love it so much, because it's really cool. So we're going to start by, I am going to share my screen. Okay. So you should see our factory there, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the kind of fabrics you're going to be seeing made, right? So it goes, obviously there are a lot of different kind of fabrics. Warp knits, which is what Darlington is, we're a warp knitter. A lot of warp knits are used in making bras, so we thought this would be a really appropriate thing for you to learn about. So let me just give you a little bit of background first. So I'm going to tell you what a warp knit is. I'm going to give you an overview of the process you're going to see in the video. Then we'll actually go to the virtual factory tour. Feel free to put questions in the chat at any time, and we'll get to those when after the tour is done. Then I'm going to give you some kind of like background, give you kind of an anchor for what you see in the video. I'm going to give you a side view of the warp knit machine itself. I'm going to talk to you about what's actually happening in the knitting process and kind of a schematic, so you can imagine the way this is working. Tell you a little bit about dyeing. We're going to have time for questions and answers, but really we have time for questions and answers, except for the video, really any time throughout the presentation. And then we'll have some wrap up. So let's go ahead and get started. So what is a warp knit? So the two major kinds of warp knits, and for those of you who joined the class last year, this is the same slide from last year. A circular knit is like a sock. It's knit in a circle, and we know that when you put on a sock, there's no seam other than the seam at the toe and the seam at the heel, right? So the knitting actually is happening in a circle. A warp knit, probably the best example would be a bathing suit. Though a lot of bathing suits are made from circular knits, most bathing suits are made from warp knits. And a good example is the Miracle suit, which, that suit that they claim makes you look 10 pounds lighter in 10 seconds. And the reason that's important is a warp knit is highly engineered and can provide consistent support and stability in the fabric. So that's kind of a general sense of the difference between a warp knit and a circular knit. And for anyone who's ever seen a loom, so a loom, obviously you're weaving, you're making a woven fabric. I think of what you're going to see is basically a loom. It's what it looks like, but there's knitting happening instead of weaving. Okay. Now, this is another visual difference of the two types of fabrics, very basically speaking. So on the left of the screen, you see it says weft knitting. Weft knitting is the same as circular knitting. And the blue is the stitch that's happening. So it's going around the fabric, making this stitch. It's connecting to the stitch before it. Whereas in a warp knitting, you can see the knitting is happening vertically, and it's going not only up and down, but also side to side. And that's what creates a kind of stability that's important in a warp knit. Okay, now this looks like a lot of words on a slide, so my apologies. But I want to at least kind of map out for you what you're going to see in the video. What is the process? So in our factory, we have two factories in Westerly, Rhode Island. So we start out, we have yarn, which comes on a big spool, comes in one door, right? And then it is warped, and you'll see what that means. It's really cool. Basically you're taking lots of different spools of yarn and making a really big spool that can weigh up to 600 pounds, right? So it's really about usually between 1,100 and 1,300 ends of yarn on this big spool that you'll see. Then the knitting will happen, and we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. Then we prepare it to be dyed. Then we dye it. Then we finish it. So basically there's dyeing. Finishing basically is drying it and opening it up so it stabilizes to a certain width and to certain physical characteristics of the fabric. Some fabrics are napped or sueded, not all of them. That's why I have that in a kind of a different font color there. Then we test everything at our facility. We inspect it. and then the fabric is ready to ship. So that gives you kind of a sense of what you're going to see, right? Okay, I'm going to go back to my presentation. Okay. So Heather, do we have a few questions that came in?
We do have a few questions.
Okay,
So,
let's start with those, and then I have some of these slides may help answer some of those questions, the ones that I have coming up.
so are the machines warped by hand, or is there a mechanical process to thread the handles? I'm assuming handles.
Those what we call beams, the big spool, the one that weighs 600 pounds. You saw that. Let me. So you can see here. You can see them at the on the screen at the top here. You can see each one of those. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 in here. So each one of those has, let's say, make it easy. So let's say it has 1,200 ends, right? And you have 4 of them. So that's 4,800 ends. Now that's just one type of yarn. You can see behind here, there's another type of yarn. Each type of yarn is called a bar. You can have between 2 to 4 bars. So just think about the number of threads there are. And the answer to that question is yes, it's actually threaded by hand. It's quite a skill someone has to be able to do that efficiently. So yes, great question.
Wow. How often do the needles need to be checked or changed? I imagine one bad needle would ruin the run.
Yes. And, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about the knitting process and how, you know, we talked about the needles are going up and down. We talked about the guide bars going around them. The space between those guide bars and the needles is tiny. It's like 2 millimeters. So these are very precise machines. But the frequency at which the needles need to be replaced has to do with a couple different things. Number one, if there's one needle out of alignment a little bit, you can see that in the quality of the fabric. And that's one of the things that the operators are doing. They're walking around looking at the machines. There's also that little light that's moving across the fabric. See if there's any defects, that'll stop the machine. But the replacement of the needles in general is usually dependent on the type of yarns, the speed of the machine, and there's one other thing. The gauge of the machine. So the closer the needles are together, the more frequently they need to be replaced. So I would say probably a good, if you need a number, I would say if it's a machine that's running 24/7, we're probably replacing the needles about every 4 to 6 months.
Would any of your warp knitting machines be able to knit with merino wool yarn?
No, and I will tell you why. So a wool or cotton, something like that, what we call staple yarn. So essentially, wool is, you know, you shear the sheep, and then you take those yarns, and they're pieces of yarn, and you spin those together. Because of that reason, the same thing with cotton. It's created the same way. You're spinning them together really tightly, and you have this kind of fuzzy yarn, which is a great yarn. But if you see the speed and the tension that's on those yarns, they would break very frequently. And every time you have a breakage, you have a defect in the fabric, because then you have to knot it back together. And that little knot, even though it's going to be very small, is going to create some kind of defect in the fabric. So we don't use any yarn that what we call staple yarn. The other problem with wool and with cotton, the same problem, is that because of the speed and the tension and all that friction, you get a little bit of fly in the air. And that would mean that one machine could contaminate another machine. And so we don't want that either. So we only use nylon, polyester, and spandex. And notice that in the nylon and the polyester, it's filament, because there are staple polyesters because they feel softer. But if you can't knit them with any kind of efficiency and quality, the kind of quality we get out of these machines. Again, another really good question.
How long does it take to thread the knitting machine? You have so many spools.
Yeah, so it takes about a week for someone to thread a machine. Now that is dependent on whether, and I'm going to move the slide forward here a little bit because I want to show you what I mean about bars. So this is the side view of the machine. So this is the spools, like the machine we just saw there were 4 spools across, right? So there would be three, and it's usually 3 or 4. So it's 3 or 4 spools like this. And each one of these spools in this line, they're a different bar. So if there are 2 bars of yarn, obviously it's a lot quicker than if there are 3 or 4. But typically it takes about a full week for someone to thread the machine. And it takes great eyesight and a lot of patience.
I'm sure, so much patience.
Yes. I think it would be really cool to do, but then I think after about 20 minutes, I'd probably I'd be like, oh, I can't keep doing this because it's too hard.
Yeah, I would give up. I agree.
Yeah.
What kind of fabric do you make that would be used in bra making?
Yeah, so we make fabrics that are used pretty much in a lot of places in the bra. We make a lot of power net fabric, so that are used in the wing of the bra. We use stretch fabrics that are molded and used in the cup. I mean, often in the cup, you want it to be pretty stable because you want it to provide support. And a lot of times those fabrics do not have any spandex. But if you take the fabric and mold it, which is meaning you take a mold and you take a bullet and you add heat and you put it together so that when you remove it, there's still the shape of the breast, so that it fits and provides support and it doesn't move a lot. The straps can also be made out of these kind of fabrics. Not every fabric has a huge amount of stretch. Some of them have a little bit of stretch, just a little bit for comfort. Some bras are made strictly out of one fabric, and it could be this product. So we pretty much have been used pretty much anywhere. There are even some bras that use the UBL fabric, the unbroken loop. We talked about the napping, and that's because they have a closure that has a Velcro on it, like that kind of hook. So it's used in a lot of places. Of course, a lot of different kind of bras out there, and nobody knows that more than the folks on this call.
Are any of your fabrics available in fabric stores, or do they go directly to the designers?
Yeah, so we do sell wholesale. We don't have any retail sellers. So most of our fabrics are purchased by probably the brands that you see in the stores. And so we make apparel, including fabrics go into bras and shapewear, other intimate apparel, into sportswear, into activewear, into leggings, into golf wear, etc. And then we make a lot of fabrics that are also used in the medical field as well. So anyone who knows who uses a CPAP machine, there's this headgear. We make a lot of fabric for the headgear. For post-surgical compression, for people who have cosmetic surgery, we make fabrics for that. For orthopedic and prosthetic uses, things like braces, we have fabrics going into that. And we also make fabrics that get some kind of proprietary coating on them that are used for skin patches, for scar mitigation, or for some like a bandage. So those are some of the places that you can see our fabrics. But generally, we do sell. As you can see, the quantities that we make are pretty large. So we're selling usually at least a dye-lot quantity, and the dye-lot quantity might be 450 yards of fabric, and then it might be as much as 2,800 yards of fabric, depending on the weight of the fabric and the way that it's dyed.
And how are you dyeing the fabric? Does the entire roll get unwound and put into the vat for a period of time, then rinsed, dried, and put back on the roll?
Well, let me just tell you that is a great question. So I'm going to come to that in just a minute. But first, I want to talk very quickly about this knitting that's happening. So you can see we talked about see the needle here under this in this A diagram. You see the needle is down and there's this little latch that's closed, right? And so then that lifts up in the B diagram. And then here's the guide with the yarn through the circle, right? And that swings around. The hook opens, and then it catches as the guide comes around, wraps around it, and then the needle goes down. The closure, it closes, and then the previous loop kind of comes off, right? So that's the knitting process that's happening sometimes 4,000 times in a minute. Okay, number one. But I do want to talk about the dyeing. There are two major types of dyeing. So it's very good timing on this question, right? There's beam dyeing and there's jet dyeing. We talked about atmospheric beam. We talked about pressure beam. We talked about atmospheric jet. And we talked about pressure. It means just that. Some of them are just open to the atmosphere. The other, actually, they're enclosed. It's like a pressure cooker. And so there's pressure inside there to facilitate the dye process. We'll try to show you a little bit of what that looks like. Okay, so this is kind of like a sliced open beam dyeing process, right? So what you see is, let's say the pink area is the fabric itself. It's wrapped around a big can, so essentially, the beam itself, and there are holes in that, all right? So it's just completely wrapped around it, and it goes into this vessel. And then what happens is the gray area where the arrows are coming in, the gray with the little black dots. So that is the dye stuff coming into that canister that has the fabric wrapped around it. And the dye then penetrates into the fabric and then out to the light gray area. So it's basically, you're forcing it into it and it comes out the side, out of the pores. And that's beam dyeing. So that's what's happening, whether that's under pressure or whether that's atmospheric. That's the way it happens. It's really fascinating. And then you take that and you rinse it, and then you put it on the finishing frame where you see you're putting it into a large heater where you put the fabric, you spread it out, you put it on these little pins on the side. It's like little needles that are sticking up, and you press it on there and you run it through this zone that heats it up to about 380 or 390 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's the final setting for the fabric, so that you don't get shrinkage, you don't get curl. So it sets the specifications for the fabric. So that's beam dyeing, okay? Jet dyeing is just this, right? So you can see this squiggly line at the bottom, this up and down, that's the fabric. And then it's lifted up by this cylinder, which is turning around, and it's just pulling the fabric, and then it slides down and it continues to go. So it gathers in the bottom, and you're just kind of rotating it through this jet. So it's a jet where the water is using the jet stream of the water is pushing and pulling the fabric through, and it's being dyed. So you get the dye process is happening. So I hope that answered that question. So it doesn't get onto the roll. So when it's finished, it gets into the small roll once the finishing happens and it's inspected, and then it's cut to the specification of the customer. Some customers say, we want a roll that's only 50 yards long. We have some customers that take rolls that are 600 yards. Obviously, no one's lifting those rolls. They're very heavy, right? So they're using forklifts and all kinds of overhead lifting equipment to maneuver those rolls. So they're quite heavy.
We have another question about dye. Is the same chemical composition used to dye polyester spandex and nylon spandex fabrics, or is it different?
Well, this person knows a lot about textiles, I think, right? So that's a very informed question. And the answer is the chemistry of nylon and the chemistry of polyester are very different, right? So there are different dye stuffs that are used to dye one versus the other. You use acid dyes to dye nylon, okay? And there are other chemicals that go along with that. And you use what we call dispersed dyes for polyester. And the difference is that the acid dyes for nylon, there's actually a chemical reaction between the nylon and the dye stuff, the acid dye. And that reaction creates a bond between the dye stuff and the nylon itself. So it attaches itself in a chemical bond. In polyester, dispersed dye, there's another kind of category for polyester. We'll come to that. But most polyester is dyed what's called dispersed dye. So essentially, the dye stuff is forced under pressure to embed itself in the yarn. So it anchors itself there, right? And that's called dispersed dye. That is something that has to be done under pressure, right? And the color fastness is usually quite good. The other way you can dye polyester is there are certain kinds of dyes, cationic dyes, that, like the nylon and the acid dyes, create a chemical bond between that dye stuff and the polyester. But the chemistry is different, obviously, from one to the other. But yes, great question. A lot of great questions in this crowd. I'm not surprised, though.
There's so many questions about dye. So let me just scroll back here. All the dyed fabrics are okay. Do you print? Do you do any print fabrics when you dye, or is it just solids?
We do not do any printing. However, we do have partners who print our fabrics. So we don't do any of that printing, but we do have partners who do. So we send our fabrics to them and they print them. There are several different ways that fabrics are printed. Nylon is printed very differently from polyester, again, just like it is a bit of a dye process. But that is, and so there are multiple ways it's printed. We don't do any of the printing ourselves.
We have a couple questions. Do different fibers prefer the beam versus the jet dyeing process? Or how would you determine which process you use to dye?
Yes. So first off, if anything that needs to be dyed under pressure, it needs to be in a pressure situation, and then like either a pressure beam or a pressure jet. The fabric itself, some fabrics tend to be too heavy to be in a jet, and when they're in that jet, you don't get a consistent level dyeing on them. So then those are the ones you really want to gear towards your beams, because you're dyeing it's open width. Whereas, you saw the red fabric coming out of the dye machine, that was a jet, and it comes out in a rope form. Whereas on the beam, it's nice and level, it's spread out, there are no wrinkles, you just spool it up on that beam, and then you dye it open width. Then certain other fabrics, if you're looking for something with, let's say it's a really dark shade and you want really good color fastness, you probably need to do that in a jet, because you can do lots of extra, you get really good post-dye scouring and rinsing of that fabric, so you can clear out any excessive dye before you send it to the customer, because no one wants to wear something or put something in the washing machine for the first time, it turns your white towels pink, right? So not that there's anything wrong with pink, by the way, but just kidding.
And when you're using these dye processes, is there a difference in the way the fabric would look after you dye it a certain way versus like jet versus beam or atmospheric or pressure dyeing?
The only difference would be you can usually achieve a deeper shade of color in the jet than in the beam, but usually for most shades, you would not be able to tell a difference. I often have to ask people, how is this dyed? Because I can't look at it and tell. And I've done this for a long time, as I think we know.
So now we have some questions about the threading in the needle. So how much yardage do you get from one threading?
Yeah, so those beams usually make about 5,000 yards of fabric. Now that's going to vary depending on the weight of the fabric, right? Obviously, the lighter the fabric, the more yardage you get out of it. But I would say a standard beam, kind of our standard kind of product, you get about 5,000 yards. So from one set of those beams. Sometimes I have to buy a lot more yarn than that. Sometimes my yarn minimum might mean I'm buying enough yarn to make 30,000 yards. But usually we try to use common yarns for multiple styles so that we can spread it out. And it also reduces our complexity.
Where do you get your filament to knit your final product? Do you manufacture the filament used in your fabrics?
No, we do not. We do not make any yarn ourselves. We buy the yarns. So we buy yarn in the U.S. We buy yarn in the CAFTA countries, because the Central America and Mexico, the NAFTA, now known as USMCA. We also import certain yarns for certain products. We import some yarns from Asia. And we've looked at yarns from time to time and used yarns from Europe as well. The majority of our production, of our products, are used in CAFTA countries, which means under the Central American Free Trade Agreement. So most of those yarns are coming from the US and Mexico.
So cool. the little chains that are created, how do you link them to the chain next to it to
Yeah,
create the
so
fabric?
I'm gonna go back to the stitch. Okay. So what's happening is that so there are multiple guide bars. It's not just one guide bar, right? So there are multiple guide bars, and the needles are taking different yarns. And that guide bar, they're moving around, but they're not doing the same thing every time, right? So different guide bars, and because of that, the positioning of all those yarns, that kind of dance that's happening, that determines, first it's hooking to the one, as you can see, if you start at the bottom of the one that warped it, first it hooks to the one on the left, right? And then it goes and hooks over to the one on the right, and then back to the left and back to the right. So there's this zigzag back and forth. And this is just one stitch. There are a lot of different stitch configurations. And so these machines, have the capability to create different stitches. And that's all part of the way that's threaded in something we call a pattern wheel, which determines the movement of all these elements that are happening in the machine while we're knitting.
Do you ever dye the yarns before you knit the cloth, or is it just dyed after the cloth has already been knitted?
You can do that. That is something that's possible. The only thing with that is you think about the warping process. So if you have all that dyed yarn to warp it, that means your quantity of that one color will be quite large. So if you have a program that is that large, there are many reasons why you would want to do that, because then you don't have to dye it. The fabric is already dyed. So right now, everything we're doing, everything is dyed after the fact. But that is not to say it cannot be done. In fact, it's something that we often think, when we have the opportunity to do that, we would certainly do that.
And how is the runoff of the dye disposed of?
Yeah, so the dye is treated in our facility, and because we live in the factory is not in an industrial zone. Actually both factories it's a residential neighborhood. And so we treat the water before it goes back to the city or to the river, right? We're very concerned about the quality of the water that's going back to the community. Not only the water, but also the air that goes back. In fact, the water that goes back to them is cleaner than the water that we get, and the air that goes out is cleaner than the air that's already around us. We have a big investment in making sure that happens.
On average, how long does it take to change from one job to the next?
From one job to the next in the dyeing process, or one job to next on the knitting machine? Because on the knitting machine, it can take, once let's say we're finished doing a particular style and we want to remove those yarns and replace it with another yarn. So that can take a few weeks to take everything out and then add a new machine in. It's probably at least 2 weeks to change over on a style point of view. On a dye point of view, let's say it might takes about 7 hours to dye a color on average. So from the time it goes into the machine, it dyes for 7 hours, it comes out, and then you put the next one in. You would not want to put a white in right behind a black. You would not want to put, so you wouldn't want to put a yellow in right behind a dark blue. So we're very deliberate about the order of the colors. And then we get to the point where we're only doing dark colors. Then we do what's called a boil out to really clean the machine. And then we start over with light colors again.
So cool. Um, what are the biggest challenges in the process, and what do you feel is the greatest success?
I think the biggest challenge in the process is that there are so many parameters that we're trying to control, right? So in the knitting room, we have to control the temperature and the humidity, because otherwise you don't want, because if the temperature changes too much, the metals expand or contract, and you get that affects your knitting. So it's a very complicated process just in the knitting alone. And then when you go to the dyeing and the finishing, you're dealing with chemistry, you're dealing with the dye stuffs, you're dealing with the machines, you're dealing with the operators, you're dealing with the humidity in the factory. There are a lot of things that we're trying to control so that the fabric that we make in January of 2020 and the same fabric we make in January of 2023 or July of 2023 is pretty much identical. So that, if you buy a garment made with that fabric, you want it to fit exactly the same way. And I think that certainly everyone on this call understands the importance of fit in a garment, because I think there's probably a lot of effort goes into finding the right fit of a bra. And that's probably why many people make their own bras, is because they can create the fit for themselves.
What is the shrinkage percentage of the fabric before being dyed and after? And do you advise your customer to wash the fabrics before they put it into the garment production?
So the shrinkage does vary by product, right? It can be, but before it's dyed, it's curls up on itself. It's a very unstable product. It wants to, imagine it can roll up like a cigar, right? So when it first comes out, we do the dye prep area, and that gives it some heat to stabilize it, right? The shrinkage is probably pretty high at that point, right? I mean, it's going to vary, but what we look at is what is the final finished shrinkage, and that varies between 2 to 5% is pretty much our target for shrinkage. But we do remember most of these fabrics have probably 90% of our fabrics have spandex in them. So shrinkage it's not true shrinkage because it's recoverable because it's a stretched fabric. But generally 2 to 5% is what we think of as acceptable for shrinkage percentage. And then the question about, do we advise our customers before they cut the fabric to wash it? We actually do not, because they do not have the capability to then refinish it. So if they tried to wash it some way, then they would have to have a big expensive piece of equipment to dry it and to dry it properly. So no, they take our fabrics, they spread them, and they cut them into garments.
How many people work for Darlington?
About 200 people.
Is there a waste product in the manufacturing of the textiles? If yes, what do you do with it?
So we have been on a mission to reduce our waste that goes to landfill, right? And I think our goal was 30% just a few years ago, and then we moved it to 50%, and then we moved it to 60%. And we can say that in May and June, and I don't have the information for July yet, but in both May and June, Darlington sent 0% of our waste to landfill. And our waste gets sold. Sold is really a very loose term. It's sold, it's given, because really not sold, to people who use it for a lot of different end uses. And often the fabric is used for what's called waste to energy. So they're converting the fabric to energy instead of putting it into a landfill.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Do you develop new colors in-house, or do you dye to customer specs only?
So we develop to customer specs. Customers tell us what colors they want, and we develop those colors for them on their fabric. So we have a lab that does that. It's called a lab dip process. And not only are we trying to get the color right, we're trying to also match the color fastness requirements of the customer for the particular end use. Obviously, if it's for swimwear, there are different requirements than if it's for yoga, or if it's for running, or if it's for medical. So what our customers tell us, for the kind of testing they want us to do on the color, and then we tell them these are the color rankings, and this is the shade itself. We usually give them multiple things to choose from. We also make sure we understand, the lighting that they're evaluating the color in, and that we're evaluating the color in under the same conditions. But to answer the question is that we custom match colors for our customers. Can we everyone come onto we can see everybody? Can we do that, Heather? Just so we can see some faces and kind of wave at each other, maybe? Would that be possible? Is that possible? Can people turn on their videos? Is that possible?
I'm not sure if it is in the
Okay.
webinar
Okay. Well, at
format.
least people can see. Well,
We
there's
can
no
see
bonus.
you.
There's no bonus in seeing me.
I could put myself on if you want, so you don't
Okay.
feel
Yeah.
like you're
Please join
disturbed.
me. Please join me. And we only have a few more minutes. I know. I know people are going to other sessions, so I
There's
would just love to. Yeah.
okay, let me
I'm gonna.
just scroll up here.
Yeah. There you
So
go. Let's a couple more questions. I think as long as we have
yeah, we can keep
minutes,
going for a
we can keep
little.
going.
Yep. How did you get into the industry? And other than giving tours, what do you do at the company?
So I am in sales, right? I have been in. I started my career. I worked in what was called dye prep, and then I worked in the dye house. And after I worked in the dye house for a few years, they said, you know what? You're not the best dyer, but we think you'd be really good in sales. So I moved into sales back in 1988, and so I've been in sales for Workman Fabrics since then. And then how did I get into the business? Quite honestly, I was trying to decide whether or not to go to graduate school. And I needed to have a job since I decided to take a year off and think about that. And I basically took the first job I was offered, and here I am, 34 years old.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Is there a minimum order run, like quantity
Yes,
wise?
there is, right? And it's usually driven by a dye lot quantity. Again, dye lot quantities might be 400 yards, and it could be as much as 2,800 yards. But so there is a minimum.
Sorry, I just saw something. Can you tell us more about the skin graft bandage fabrics?
Yeah, it's not skin graft, right? So what they're doing, people are taking our fabric and they put some kind of coating on it. So they coat it themselves with some kind of proprietary chemistry, and then they put that on a wound, right? We have some fabrics that are coated with silver in there, and they use it for burn victims. This would be for someone who, like, you have a treatment, and then it's a bandage that's put on there to mitigate scars or to help some type of specific healing. So yeah, not skin graft. So that's beyond our capability.
How do you recommend we care for the fabrics?
So the kind of fabrics that we make, which are nylon, polyester, nylon spandex, and polyester spandex, you can put them in the washing machine and you can dry them. We do not recommend bleach, and we do not recommend fabric softener, actually. So we don't recommend either one of those things. But if you really want to take great care of them, I would hand wash them, mild detergent, and I'd let them drip dry. But that's not really practical in today's world, right? So the washing machine and the dryer is what most of us going to do. And I have garments made out of these fabrics that have lasted me many years doing just that. So
if someone wanted to create a new specialty fabric, would they be able to contact you to knit the fabric for promo or production?
they would, but because of the scale of the kind of business that we do, it would probably require a pretty large commitment up front. We are kind of a large scale producer. And the same machines that run production we use to make the developments. So we do a little bit of dance between developing and production. So when we're really busy with production, it's harder to get our developments out. So when things do slow down, we see that as an opportunity to get more developments out. But people are welcome to contact me about anything. I'm Jack Boyd. I'm at Darlington Fabrics, darlingtonfabrics.com. You'll see my email on the website. You can see my phone number. If there's questions you have, let me know. I'll be happy to help.
There's a lot of questions about what stores we can find your fabrics and how to find your fabrics. And if you have anything, a place to buy any leftovers.
Yeah, so it's hard. Yeah, the leftovers. It's hard to go to a store and buy our fabric, right? I mean, you will see our fabrics in a lot of products in the market, right? I'll give you an example. If anyone owns a fan jersey for the NFL, right, one of those fan jerseys, that's our fabric. We make that fabric. We make a lot of it, right? So if you own a fan jersey, you own a Darlington product. We make a lot of products for Under Armour. We make products for Nike. We make products for, if you know Cupid, if you know Miracle Suit. So we make products for a lot of different companies, a lot of brands out there, but can't buy our fabric. And in terms of buying the small quantity, if you're really looking for something specific, give me a call and I'll try to direct you to something if you're something you're really looking for and it's really, and if we can help you, we'll certainly will.
What is the most sustainable type of fabric that you manufacture?
So we make a fabric that it's a nylon fabric, a nylon and spandex, and it's made with a special chemistry that accelerates the biodegradability of the nylon. So which is really exciting, right? Because these are synthetic products. And we know there's work being done to also do the same thing for spandex, to have a spandex that's biodegradable. Now, biodegradable, okay, let's say it accelerates biodegradability. Right now, those products will last decades, but this accelerates that. So it breaks down both in landfill conditions and in the oceans where we get a lot of microfibers, especially when you wash products and microfibers come off, it gets into the water system. That's a concern. And this new product is really helpful. It's called Ciclo, CICLO. You can look it up on the internet, CICLO, Ciclo. It'll talk to you a little bit about the product and how it works, but we're very excited about it.
That's so cool. It's fascinating. Oh my gosh.
Really.
Are elastics made using a similar process to what you guys do?
Yeah, so the elastics, meaning the waistbands and the bra straps, those are generally knitted or woven. There are two different types. And we have a sister company that makes, woven elastic products, like the example, like waistband, for example. So it's a similar process, but it's quite different because most of them are quite narrow. Usually the widest one is about 12 inches, right? So, and a lot of them are, a half inch or, depending on the product. So it's similar because a lot of them are nylon and spandex or polyester and spandex. And because of that reason, there are a lot of similarities, but otherwise it's a pretty different process.
Fabulous. If you guys have any more questions, we do have about 2 minutes to answer any more questions, but that's all that I have in the box at the moment.
I just want to thank you all for your great questions and for being with us today. It's exciting for us. I mean, like I said, I get really excited every time I see the same mill over and over again. And every time I go, I learn something new. I mean, this week when we were doing a tour for a customer, and I was like, I didn't know that. All these years, I'm learning something new about this process. So it's just, yeah, it's fun. It's fun to see.
This has been so fascinating. Oh, we have one more question. Is spandex always blended with other fibers?
Yes, it is. There's 100% spandex would not be very attractive. Spandex does not actually dye. You can stain it, but you're not going to be able to dye it, right? And so 100% spandex product would actually not be very interesting to anybody, right? It's combined. It can be, and you can combine it with fibers other than what we use. We're only doing warp knit, so we're only combining with polyester and nylon. But you can combine spandex. You can, there are jeans that have spandex. So you can do cotton. I mean, pretty much any other yarn for the most part. You can wool. We talked about wool earlier. Someone asked about wool. There's wool spandex out there. There's cotton. There's rayon. There's acrylic. There's all kinds of products you can combine with spandex. For us, though, it's only nylon and polyester because of our technology.
Fabulous. This has been so fascinating. One last question here before I end everything. So is it possible to bring the fabric back to a raw material you can reuse?
It's easier to do that for the products that don't contain spandex, right? So that is a big concern of the industry. I attended a session, a webinar at a trade show recently, and that was, circularity, I think, is a word that we all think about. So how can we wear it, give it back, and then it comes back to us as something else, right? That's easy to do if it's all nylon or all polyester. In fact, that's easy to do if it's just one yarn, period, right? But once you start combining yarns, and spandex at this point is the limiting factor, but there's a tremendous amount of R&D being done to address that issue because it's something that we're all concerned about.
So great. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation.
Thank you, everyone.